There is a moment, and you only recognize it looking backward, where everything that was about to go wrong was already in motion. I know that moment now. It was a Tuesday. Early. The kind of morning where the building hums before the people arrive, where the coffee stations are still clean, and the conference rooms still smell like last night's cleaning crew. I had numbers on my screen that I had stayed until midnight to finish. Good numbers. The kind that make directors look brilliant in board presentations. I remember thinking, this is the week it finally pays off. I had no idea someone had already decided it was the week I disappear. Chaewon Kim remembers it differently. I know this because he told me later, quietly, the way people confess things they are still ashamed of, that he had seen the signs. That his assistant had flagged the internal investigation request, and he had been on a call. That he had watched Hans smile at me from across a room 3 weeks earlier, and registered it as a warning he did not act on. He set his phone face down. That detail stays with me. Not because I blame him. I have moved past the inventory of who failed me and when, but because it is the truest thing about how power works in spaces like that one. The people who could have spoken rarely do. Not because they are cruel, because they are busy, because there is always another call, another meeting, another reason to wait. And while they wait, people like me are already being erased. I want to tell you what happened in that conference room. But first, I need you to understand what it cost me to walk in there trusting anyone at all. When I was good at my job, I do not say that to brag. I say it because you need to understand what was at stake and what they were willing to destroy to protect themselves. 3 years at Halcyon Group. 3 years of closing deals that other people took credit for. Of staying late in buildings that never fully felt like mine. Of smiling through feedback that was never really about my performance. I had mentored 6 junior analysts. 3 of them had been promoted. I had pulled the Meridian acquisition back from the edge when the numbers were bleeding, and no one else had the patience to find the fix. I was good. And none of that mattered on the morning Director Han decided I was more useful as a casualty than a colleague. The meeting invitation came at 8:47 a.m., no subject line. Just a conference room number and a time, 9:15. I did not think twice. I had been in that room 100 times. I walked in carrying my tablet, still thinking about the quarterly numbers. 30 people were already seated. That was the first sign. You do not need 30 people for a routine meeting. You need 30 people when you want an audience. I stood in the center of that glass room, and I felt the temperature of it before a single word was spoken. The junior analysts I had trained would not look at me. The senior women I had eaten lunch with, complained about bad clients with, celebrated promotions with. They stared at the table. Han sat at the head, calm, satisfied. The way someone looks when they have already won and are simply waiting for the other person to realize it. Then the email arrived. I did not see it happen, but I felt it. The shift in the room. Phones lighting up quietly, one by one. Eyes moving from screens to me. The company-wide email had gone out while I was still standing there. Effective immediately, Carmella Cole is terminated for gross misconduct and breach of trust. Han let the silence stretch. He wanted me to feel the weight of 30 people reading my name attached to those words. Then he slid a file across the table. Printed emails, timestamps, my name, my credentials, communications that looked exactly, deliberately, surgically, like I had leaked acquisition data to a competitor. My hands were steady when I picked it up. I do not know how. Inside, I was in freefall. This is manipulated, I said. Han tilted his head, patient as a surgeon. Are you calling our internal investigation incompetent? No. And I was calling it what it was, a setup, built over weeks by someone with access, motive, and absolutely no conscience. But I could not say that in a room full of people who had already decided. Because that is the thing about a public accusation. It does not need to be true. It only needs to be loud. And Han had made sure this one echoed through every inbox in the building before I could draw a single breath of defense. Security came before I finished speaking. Before I tell you what was really behind that file, let me ask you something. Have you ever been betrayed by someone who smiled at you every single day? Someone who used everything you gave them, your loyalty, your work, your trust, and then handed it back to you as a weapon? Because that is exactly what this was. And if you have ever stood somewhere, a job, a relationship, a room full of people, and realized that the person who was supposed to protect you was the one who set the fire, you already know how this feels. Hit subscribe right now, not for me, but for every version of yourself that stayed silent when someone did this to you. Because this story is not just mine. And what happens next, I promise you, you are not ready for it. There is something nobody tells you about being escorted out of a building. It is not the box. It is not the eyes watching from behind glass as you cross the lobby. It is not even the cold air that hits you when the doors open and you realize, this is it. This is the outside now. It is the silence, the specific, a heavy silence of a world that has already moved on from you before you even reached the curb. I stood there holding a box that contained 3 years of my life. A coffee mug, a few folders, a small framed photo I kept on my desk of my mother at her college graduation. The first person in our family. She had worn that gown like armor. I was still looking at her face in that photo when the black sedan pulled up. I almost ignored it. Then the door opened and Chaewon stepped out, and the air did something I cannot fully explain. It rearranged itself. The small crowd of employees lingering near the entrance shifted their attention without meaning to, the way people do when someone who carries real authority enters a space. He looked at me first, then, briefly, deliberately, at the building behind me, then back at me. "I told you," he said. "So if they ever cross the line, I would handle it." And here's where I have to be honest with you, because this story does not work if I am not. I wanted to believe him. I had wanted to believe him for years. Chaewon Kim had said those words to me once before, in a different context, at a different point in both our lives, when the power between us was less complicated and the stakes felt smaller. Back then, the promise had felt solid, real, like something a person actually meant. But promises made in private rooms have a way of evaporating when the public cost gets high enough, and he had already proven that once. He had watched Hans circle me for weeks. His assistant had flagged the investigation. He had been on a call. He had set his phone face down. So when he stood on that curb and offered me 30 minutes, 30 minutes to do what, I still was not entirely sure. I did not feel rescued. I felt the particular exhaustion of a woman who has heard the right words at the wrong time one too many times. But I had a box in my hands and 30 people celebrating inside that building. And sometimes, when every door has been shut and locked from the inside, you hold a stranger's promise, even a broken one, just long enough to see if this time is different. I did not give him the box. But I did not walk away either. 30 minutes. That is what Jaewon asked for. 30 minutes to do something I could not yet name, in a building that had just finished publicly destroying me. While I stood on that curb trying to decide if I was brave or just desperate, and I did not know the full shape of what Han had built. I only knew the part I had lived through, the file, the room, the email, the box. But the truth? The truth was so much colder than I imagined. Han had been leaking acquisition intelligence to a competitor called Vantara Group for 14 months. 14. That means while I was staying late pulling the Meridian deal back from collapse, while I was building the exact numbers that made Halcyon look untouchable to outside investors, Han was selling those same numbers out the back door. He needed someone to absorb the consequence before the board's annual audit exposed the gaps. He needed a name, and he chose mine with the kind of precision that kept me up at night when I finally learned it. Not randomly, specifically. I was high profile enough that my termination would read as credible, and I was isolated enough that no one would publicly stand up for me. And I was a black woman in a space that had always found it easy to believe the worst about my ambition. His assistant had accessed my credentials 6 weeks before that meeting. The emails were constructed slowly, carefully, timestamps adjusted, language calibrated to sound exactly like me, but slightly off, the way a forgery always is when you know where to look. Han had even rehearsed his delivery, grateful we didn't press charges. That line was not improvised. It was designed to humiliate, to make me feel like I should be thankful for being destroyed quietly. What he never calculated, what his entire plan had no room for, was Jae-won Kim. Not because Jae-won was my protector, I want to be clear about that. He was not watching over me. And he was watching the company, preparing a full acquisition, running valuations, and my performance metrics were central to every number he trusted. When Han erased me, he flagged every single thing he had been hiding. He did not just destroy my career. He handed Chae-won the exact thread that unraveled everything. I have replayed what happened in that boardroom many times. Not because I was there. I was not. I was still outside, holding a box, standing in the specific cold that belongs to people who have just lost something they built with their hands. But I know what happened. Because afterward, people talked. People always talk when power shifts fast enough to scare them. Jae-won did not call ahead. That was the first thing. There was no warning email, no assistant scheduling a slot. By no courtesy call to let Han know the dynamic was about to change completely. Jae-won simply walked back into that building, took the elevator to the executive floor, and sat down at the head of the boardroom table. The board members who came with him were not the internal board. They were acquisition-level stakeholders, people with the kind of authority that made Han's entire title feel suddenly decorative. People who had never sat in that room before. People whose presence meant one thing and one thing only. This conversation had already moved beyond anything Han could manage. Han walked in and saw the room, and I am told, by someone who was seated 3 chairs away, that his face went through 5 different expressions in under 2 seconds before he settled on the one he thought looked calm. Meh, it did not look calm. "We weren't informed you'd be attending," Han said. Chae-won looked at him the way you look at something small that has briefly inconvenienced you. "You weren't meant to be informed," he said. 1 sentence. The room went still. Then the files came out. Not the fabricated ones. Those were already on the table as evidence of what they were, forgeries. What came out now were the real records, server logs pulled from the company's own system, email chains that Han's team had deleted but not deeply enough, competitor contact records, 14 months of them, traced directly and without ambiguity to Han's credentials. Every communication, every date, every figure passed to Vantara Group while Han sat in meetings talking about company loyalty. Jae-won walked through it without raising his voice once. And that is the detail that stayed with everyone who was in that room. He was not angry. He was not dramatic. He was simply methodical, the way someone is methodical when they are not trying to convince anyone of anything because the evidence does not require performance. "You fabricated evidence," he said to Han. "You authorized an illegal internal investigation. And you attempted to destroy a top-performing employee to cover your own misconduct." Han's mouth opened. "The data was never accessed from her credentials," Jae-won continued. "Your account shows repeated contact with Vantara, and the timestamps on those emails do not match the server activity logs by a margin that no competent investigator would miss." Han closed his mouth, because there was nothing left to say. The truth does not negotiate, and it does not wait for you to find better words. It sits in the middle of the room and it simply is. And everyone present has to decide, in real time, whether they were on the right side of it or not. Most people in that room were not, and they knew it. And Jae-won let them sit with that knowledge for a long, quiet moment before he said the next thing. "I want to talk about the women, not Han. Not the executives who looked away. The women, specifically, because that silence was the one that cut deepest and took the longest to stop bleeding. There were 6 of them in that conference room who knew me, really knew me. Not as a colleague you nod at near the coffee station. Women I had mentored, eaten lunch with, stayed late alongside. Women I had gone to bat for when their names came up in promotion conversations. And the room got quiet in that particular way. Rooms get quiet when a woman's ambition makes certain people uncomfortable. I had written recommendation letters, shared contacts, sat with two of them through situations at work that they never wanted documented, because documentation means acknowledgement, and acknowledgement means consequences they were not ready to face. And I gave them everything I had. And in that glass room, not one of them said a word. I understand why. I do. And that understanding is its own kind of grief, because it means I cannot even have the clean anger of being betrayed by strangers. I was betrayed by people who had calculated the cost of speaking and decided their own position was worth more than my name. That is human. That is a choice people make every day in rooms exactly like that one. But it still took something from me I have not fully named yet. The one that stayed with me most was Priya. I had championed Priya for a senior analyst promotion 8 months before that morning, had walked into a room of 3 directors and made the case for her specifically, her instincts, her numbers, her potential. She got the role. Priya had known something was wrong with the investigation. I learned this later. She had seen the file before it was presented to HR, had been told it was already confirmed, had been warned, implicitly, carefully, that raising questions would delay her own next step. She stayed quiet. After everything fell apart, someone found my mentorship notes still saved on the shared drive. Detailed documents, growth plans, skill observations, encouragement I had written out and never made a show of. Priya found hers on a Wednesday night. She read it alone. I was not there to see it, but I heard she sat with it for a long time. While the boardroom was taking Han apart piece by piece, I was still outside. I knew something was shifting. You feel it before you see it. The energy of a building changing from the inside, and the way people start moving differently when the ground has moved under them. Executives I recognized began trickling through the lobby doors, phones already at their ears, the confidence they'd worn all morning completely stripped from their faces. I watched them and I felt nothing I expected to feel. I thought I would feel relief or satisfaction. Maybe that specific warmth that comes when justice moves in the direction it was always supposed to. Instead, I felt tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes. The kind that settles into your chest after you have held yourself together in a public place for longer than any person should have to. The kind that arrives when the immediate danger has passed and your body finally sends the bill for everything it cost you to stay composed. I stepped away from the entrance, found a quieter stretch of pavement around the side of the building where no one was performing concern in my direction. And I called my mother. She picked up on the second ring. I did not say much. I told her I was okay. I told her it was over. Or the worst part was. She asked me if I had eaten. I almost laughed. She asked me again, seriously, because that is how she has always handled crisis. Food first, falling apart second. I told her yes, I had not. We stayed on the phone for 4 minutes. She did not tell me I was strong. She did not tell me I was brave. She just stayed on the line and breathed with me, the way she used to when I was small and the world felt too big. 4 minutes. Then I straightened my back, put my phone in my pocket, and walked back toward the entrance. Not because I was ready. Because I had never once waited until I was ready. And I was not about to start now. You know what nobody talks about? The part after the betrayal, where you are standing outside, holding the pieces, trying to decide if you still have enough left to keep going. Not the revenge, not the justice, the in-between, where you already gave everything and the people you gave it to are still inside that building, still comfortable, still certain they made the right call. That part. If you have ever been in that in-between, if you have ever loved a job, a person, a place with everything you had, and still walked out carrying a box, you already know what this feels like. Don't scroll past this. Subscribe right now. Not because you owe me anything, but because you deserve to see how this ends. Because I promise you, the ending is worth every single second of the wait. Han came out through the main lobby entrance. That was not an accident. There is a side exit on the east wing of the building, a service corridor that leads directly to the parking structure. Quiet, unobserved. The kind of exit you use when you want to move someone out of a building without creating a moment. Jaewon gave specific instructions that Han would not use that exit. He would come out through the front. I did not know this at the time. I was standing near the entrance again by then. I had moved back when the executive stream started thinning, something pulling me toward the building like I needed to see it through to its end. Yet a small crowd had gathered without quite meaning to. Employees who had found reasons to be near windows, assistants who had suddenly remembered something near the lobby, people who had watched me leave an hour ago and were now, quietly, watching to see what came next. The doors opened, and there was Han. Not in handcuffs, not yet, that would come shortly, in a less public moment, but flanked. Two law enforcement officers on either side of him, not theatrical, not aggressive, just present. And that presence alone was enough to make the entire lobby understand exactly what was happening. He was smaller than I remembered. That is the strange thing about watching power leave a person in real time. An hour ago, he had sat at the head of a conference table and the room had arranged itself around him. And now he was moving through a lobby, and the room was arranging itself away from him. Not dramatically, just the natural instinct people have to create distance from a falling thing. He saw me. I know he did because he looked up at exactly the right moment, and his eyes landed on mine before he could redirect them. I want to tell you I felt powerful in that moment. I want to tell you justice tasted like something clean and final. But what I actually felt was quieter than that. I looked at him and I thought, you built this, every piece of it, the file, the email, the 30 witnesses, the security escort. You built the entire architecture of my destruction, and you were so certain it would hold. I held his gaze. I did not smile. I did not speak. I did not give him the dignity of a reaction. And I simply looked at him until he was the one who looked away. That was the moment. Not the law enforcement, not the boardroom, not even what came after. The moment he looked away first. That was when it was over. He came out last. That gap between Han's exit and Jaewon's arrival. I counted it without meaning to, long enough to feel deliberate, long enough for everyone present to understand that those were two completely different kinds of departure. Han left because he had no choice. Kaewon walked out because he was finished. He moved through the lobby doors, and the small crowd that had gathered near the entrance did what crowds always do around him. Shifted, adjusted, made room without being asked. He did not look at any of them. He walked directly toward me, and there was something in that directness that I was not prepared for. No hesitation, no performance. Just a man who had decided where he was going and was already there in his mind before his feet caught up. He stopped close enough that I could see the tension he was carrying beneath the calm. It lived just under his jaw, in the slight set of his shoulders. The kind of tension that belongs to someone who has just done something necessary and is now standing in front of the consequence of having waited too long to do it. You should come back inside, he said. After what they did? They won't be there anymore. I looked at him for a long moment. Why now, Jaewon? Of everything. Why now? The pause before he answered was not evasion, yet it was the specific silence of someone choosing honesty over a cleaner response. Because I let it go too far, he said, and because you were never meant to fight this alone. 7 words. You were never meant to fight this alone. I have turned those words over many times since that afternoon, examined them from every angle. Because on one side they are an apology, genuine, quiet, carrying real weight, and on the other side they are an admission that he knew. That somewhere in the weeks before that conference room he had seen enough to act and chosen his call over my name. Both things are true. That is the complicated part. He extended his hand. Not as a boss extending an offer, not as a powerful man doing a favor. Something else, harder to name, easier to feel, an alliance, a reckoning. Something that existed in the space between professional and personal and refused to be neatly filed into either. I looked at his hand, then at the building behind him. Then I placed my hand in his, not because I had forgiven everything, but because I had never once let what I had not yet resolved stop me from moving forward. The lobby felt different the second time. Same floors, same glass, same corporate lighting that had watched me leave an hour ago, carrying everything I had built reduced to a cardboard box. But different. I had set the box down outside. I realized that only after I was already through the doors. I had not made a decision about it. My hands had simply let it go at some point between the curb and the entrance, and I had walked in without it. Why, without the coffee mug and the folders and my mother's graduation photo. I would get the photo later, the rest I did not need. The receptionist, who had carefully avoided my eyes during the escort out, was now standing straighter, not performing warmth, just present in a way she had not been an hour ago. The analyst near the elevator bank moved without being asked, creating space in that instinctive way people do when they understand, suddenly and completely, that they misjudged who they were dealing with. No one spoke. I did not need them to. There is a specific power in a silence that belongs to you. When a room is quiet because it chose to diminish you, that silence is a weapon pointed at you. But when a room is quiet because it is recalibrating, but because it is sitting with the gap between what it assumed and what turned out to be true, that silence belongs to you completely. You can walk through it like a hallway. I walked through it like a hallway. Chewan was beside me but slightly behind, and I understood, without us discussing it, that this entrance was mine to lead. He had handled the boardroom. This, the lobby, the eyes, the recalibration, this was mine. I did not look around to see who was watching. I did not need the confirmation. I walked to the elevator, pressed the button, and stood with my back straight and my eyes forward. The doors opened. I stepped in. And for the first time since 9:15 that morning, I exhaled. When I walked back into that building, people called it a comeback. But I need you to understand something. I never left. They removed me. They escorted me out. They sent a company-wide email with my name attached to words designed to make sure I could never walk back in with my head up. But they could not remove what I knew, what I had built, who I was before that building ever had my name on a badge. And here is what I want to ask you, right now, in this moment. Has someone ever tried to write your ending for you? Has someone ever made a decision about who you are in a room you were not allowed to be in? If yes, this channel exists for you. Subscribe right now, because what happens next in this story is exactly what people who underestimate you never see coming. And you deserve to watch every single second of it. 3 weeks after Han was escorted out through the front lobby, and I walked into the Halcyon Annual Stakeholder Gala in a black gown that cost more than my first paycheck at that company. I want to be honest about the gown. It was not accidental. Nothing about that evening was accidental. The gala was held at the Meridian rooftop, which, if you have been following closely, was the exact acquisition I had saved 3 years prior. The irony of that location was not lost on me. The building that bore the name of my biggest professional win was now hosting the event where I would walk back into the same social circle that had watched me be destroyed and was now being forced to reckon with what they had celebrated. I was not attending as a reinstated employee. That is important. Chewan's acquisition team had brought me in as a transition consultant, which meant I was no longer subject to the internal hierarchy that Han had used to build his case against me. I had a different kind of authority now, the kind that does not require a title on a door. The kind that comes from being the person in the room who everyone knows holds information they cannot afford to have released at the wrong moment. I arrived alone, intentionally. The room performed normalcy, the way expensive rooms always perform normalcy when something uncomfortable is present. The conversations continued, the glasses were lifted, the networking smiles stayed fixed. But I felt the tracking, the peripheral attention. Every cluster of people I passed doing that specific recalibration where they glance once, and then glance again, and then spend the next 30 seconds deciding how to position themselves. Han was gone. But Han's infrastructure was not. The people who had benefited from his influence, who had looked the other way, co-signed his decisions, let his version of events become the official record, they were still in that room, still employed, still positioned, still carrying the quiet confidence of people who believed that because they had not been named, they had not been seen. I let them believe that, for the first part of the evening. Then Celeste found me near the East Terrace, Celeste Morgan, Senior VP of Corporate Affairs, and the woman who had sat 3 seats from Han in that conference room and had not only stayed silent, but had, I later learned, actively vouched for the validity of the internal investigation when HR raised procedural questions. She approached me with a champagne glass and a smile that had been professionally calibrated to project warmth. "Carmella," she said, "you look well." "I am," I said. "I imagine all of this has been quite an adjustment." There it was, wrapped in pleasantry, tucked inside a compliment. The framing she needed me to accept. Adjustment. As though what happened was a corporate restructuring rather than a deliberate, documented attempt to end my career using fabricated evidence. I looked at her over my glass. "It has been clarifying," I said. Her smile did not move, but something behind her eyes shifted. She had come to take my temperature, to measure how much I knew, how much I was willing to say, how dangerous I still was to the people who had not yet been named publicly. She left that terrace knowing the answer, and I let her carry it back to whoever was waiting. Celeste moved fast. I will give her that. Within 4 days of the gala, a revised version of everything that had happened began circulating through the same professional networks that had watched my termination in real time. Not loud. Celeste was too careful for loud. Quiet. The way misinformation always moves when it is being managed by someone who understands reputation as a resource. The version she was spreading had 3 specific adjustments. First, my reinstatement was framed as a personal favor from Chaewon. Not justice. Not the result of documented fraud being exposed. A favor. The implication being that I was back not because I was right, but because I was connected to the right person. Second, the evidence against me had been inconclusive rather than fabricated. That single word, inconclusive. Doing the quiet work of keeping doubt alive, of making sure that every person who heard the story walked away with a small residue of uncertainty about who I really was. Third, Han's misconduct was being reframed as a management style issue rather than deliberate fraud, as though 14 months of competitor intelligence leaking was a personality flaw rather than a criminal act. It was elegant, I will admit, the kind of narrative management that requires real skill and zero conscience. A business journalist named Todd Larkin picked it up, ran a speculative piece, careful language, strategic hedging, with a headline that asked whether the Halcyon situation was a case of corporate overcorrection. The piece quoted 2 anonymous sources close to the company. One of them had Celeste's particular sentence structure. I noticed, my attorney noticed. The piece ran on a Thursday. By Friday morning, it had circulated through 4 major professional networks and landed in the inboxes of at least 3 board-adjacent figures who had been watching the situation carefully. I read it at 6 a.m., with coffee I did not taste. Then I made one phone call. Not to Chaewon, not to my attorney, to a journalist named Dr. Charlotte Jonas, A black woman who had been covering corporate culture and finance for 11 years and had the kind of reputation that made sources trust her with things they would not put in writing. We had met once, briefly, at a conference 2 years prior. She had handed me her card and said, "If you ever have a real story, call me." I had kept the card. I told her I had documentation, a full timeline, server logs, defabricated email analysis, competitor contact records, all part of an active legal filing. She asked me one question. "Are you ready to go on record?" I did not hesitate. "I have been ready," I said, "since the moment they sent that email." The interview ran on a Tuesday. 3 platforms simultaneously: Dr. Jonas's newsletter, which had 80,000 professional subscribers, a business media outlet called The Current, and a podcast called On the Record that pulled an audience of corporate professionals who did not have time for noise and had built their loyalty around the understanding that what aired on that show had been verified. I wore navy. I chose it deliberately. Not because I was performing composure, but because I genuinely felt it. By the time those cameras were on, I had moved through the anger, through the exhaustion, through the specific grief of being publicly accused by people who knew the accusation was false. What I had left was clarity. And clarity, I have learned, is far more powerful than anger in a documented setting. Dr. Jonas did not handle me gently. I had not asked her to. She asked me about the morning of the termination, about what it felt like to stand in a room of 30 people and read my own name in a company-wide email before a single word of defense was permitted. I answered directly. I did not perform pain. I simply described what happened and let the audience feel whatever they felt. Then she asked me about the evidence. And that is where the interview became something else entirely. I walked through the timeline. The server logs showing my credentials had never accessed the files I was accused of leaking. The forensic email analysis, commissioned by Jaewon's legal team, identifying the specific metadata inconsistencies in every fabricated document. The competitor contact records traced to Han's account across 14 months. The internal messages between Han and his assistant, recovered from a backup server, discussing the selection of my name as the target. I did not editorialize. I presented. Dr. Jonas asked me about the language used in that conference room. People like her. I repeated it plainly. I explained what it meant in the specific context of being a black woman in a space that had always treated my competence as an anomaly to be managed rather than an asset to be developed. I did not speak with bitterness. And I spoke with the precision of someone who had spent 3 years studying the architecture of that particular bias and could now describe it from the outside. The response was immediate. By Wednesday morning, the piece had been shared across professional networks in numbers that made Celeste's quiet campaign look like a whisper against a PA system. The business community that had absorbed my termination with quiet satisfaction was now being confronted, publicly and with full documentation, with exactly how it had been manufactured. Silence became harder to maintain. And in an apartment across the city, Priya watched the full interview with the volume low and her knees pulled to her chest. Then she picked up her phone. She called my attorney's office at 9:47 on a Wednesday morning. And I did not find out until that afternoon. My attorney called me between meetings, voice measured in the specific way attorneys get measured when something significant has arrived that they do not want to oversell before they are certain of its weight. "A witness has come forward," she said. "Who?" A pause. "Priya Nair." I sat with that for a moment, longer than I expected to need. Priya's testimony was not dramatic in its delivery. That is what made it devastating. She did not come forward with emotion or performance. She came with dates, specifics, a precise account of a Tuesday morning 6 weeks before my termination, when Han's chief of staff had walked into her office, placed a closed folder on her desk and told her carefully, when with a particular smile, that the investigation into Carmella Cole had already been confirmed and that any questions she had should be directed upward rather than sideways. She had understood what that meant. She had known the file was being constructed, had suspected specifically that my credentials were being used without my knowledge, had weighed the cost of speaking, her promotion, her position, her own carefully built professional standing in a company that had demonstrated it was not above destroying people who became inconvenient. And she had stayed quiet. She said all of this in her statement, plainly, without excusing herself. That mattered to me more than I expected it to. We met once, briefly, after the legal process had moved forward enough that the meeting was no longer complicated. And it was not warm. I will not describe it as something it was not. We sat across from each other and we were honest, which is sometimes the most. Two people can offer each other when something real has passed between them. She told me she had read the mentorship notes. I told her I knew. She did not ask me to forgive her immediately, and I did not offer it immediately, and somehow that honesty made the conversation more real than any reconciliation scene I could have scripted. What I told her before we parted was this: what you did with the truth, once you had the courage to hold it, that matters. That is the part that counts now. She nodded. Her eyes were wet. Mine were not. Not because I felt less, but because I had already done my crying in places where no one needed to witness it. We moved forward. Because the work was not finished. Priya's testimony broke the last wall. With her account added to the legal file, an internal witness who had been present, who had been warned to stay silent, who could now speak to the premeditated nature of the entire setup. Celeste's revised narrative did not just weaken, it collapsed. The business journalist who had run the overcorrection piece issued a correction within 48 hours. Brief, clinical, the kind of correction that is technically an acknowledgement, but reads as an institution quietly stepping away from something before the heat reaches them. Todd Larkin's byline had been on the wrong side of a documented fraud. He knew it. His editor knew it. The correction ran on a Friday, which is when publications bury things they hope people will miss over the weekend. People did not miss it. Two board-adjacent figures who had been carefully neutral since Han's arrest issued formal statements, distancing themselves from the internal investigation process. Not apologies. These were not people who apologized. But the statements existed. They were on record. And in the world of corporate reputation, going on record about what you did not do is often the loudest acknowledgement available that you know what you should have done. Celeste saw all of this happening. She was not unintelligent. Her entire professional identity had been built on reading rooms quickly and repositioning before the tide shifted against her. She moved to make one final play, a private meeting request submitted formally through her assistant to Jaewon's office, flagged as urgent. He declined it in writing. Then that detail, the written declination, was the one that finished her. Because a written response creates a record, and a record means that every subsequent claim she might make about the nature of their relationship, about what she was or was not involved in, would sit permanently alongside his formal, documented decision to refuse her access. She resigned on a Friday afternoon. Her announcement was 3 sentences. Effective immediately. Pursuing other opportunities. Grateful for her time at Halcyon. By Saturday morning, every major business and corporate culture account that covered the industry had run the full arc: the termination, the fabrication, the interview, Priya's testimony, the correction, the resignation. My name, which Han had attached to gross misconduct in an email designed to ensure I could never professionally recover, was now attached to a story about exactly what I had survived and exactly what had happened to the people who built it. I read the coverage that Saturday morning from my own apartment. Coffee that I actually tasted this time. Sunlight coming through a window I had chosen, in a space that was entirely mine. I did not celebrate. I did not post. I did not perform relief for an audience. I simply sat with it, the full weight of what it had cost and what it had produced. And I let myself feel both things without rushing past either one. Then I opened my laptop, and I got back to work. 6 months later, I am not who I was when I walked into that glass room. And I want to be careful about how I say that, because the version of me that walked into that room was not broken. She was not naive. She was not someone who needed to be rescued or rebuilt. She was a woman who had built something real in a space that was never fully designed for her, and she deserved better than what was done to her. But 6 months later, I am clearer. I did not go back to Halcyon permanently. I thought about it, longer than I expected to, if I am honest. There was a part of me that wanted to return to the exact chair, the exact desk, the exact quarterly meeting where I had once presented numbers that saved a division, and simply continue, as proof, as statement. I decided against it, not because I was afraid, because I had outgrown the size of what returning would have meant. I consult independently now, but my name carries the kind of weight that institutions pay for rather than attempt to manage, and that distinction matters more to me than any title on any door. I work with 3 companies currently, 2 of which came to me directly after the interview ran. They had read the documentation. They had seen how I handled the public exposure, the precision, the composure, the refusal to perform victimhood, and they wanted that quality of thinking applied to their own operations. I am building something of my own. I am not ready to name it yet, but it is coming. The women who watched me be escorted out of that building, some have reached out, some have not. I have made peace with both, which is its own form of freedom. Chewan exists in my life in a way that I am choosing to let define itself slowly. There is history between us that is real and unresolved, and neither of us is pretending otherwise. What I know is that he is not who I thought he was at 22, and I am not who he thought I was either. We are something more honest than that now. Whatever that becomes, I am not rushing it. The final thing I want to tell you is this. On a Tuesday morning, 6 months after the Tuesday they tried to erase me, I sat at my own desk, in my own space, with numbers on my screen that belonged entirely to me. No one was watching. No one needed to be. Because the most complete form of justice I have ever found is not in what happened to Han, or Celeste, or the room full of people who stayed silent when my name was in that email. It is in the fact that I am still here, still building, still entirely, completely, unapologetically myself. They thought they were writing my ending. They were writing my beginning. Sometimes revenge is not loud. Sometimes it looks like a Tuesday morning, a quiet desk, your own numbers, a window you chose. No audience, no performance, just you. Still standing, still building, still completely yourself after everything they threw at you. If this story reached something in you, if you recognized any part of this in your own life, then you already know why this channel exists. Subscribe right now, not for me. For every person watching this in silence who needs to be reminded that the people who tried to write your ending forgot one thing. You are still holding the pen.